Okay, so we are now recording. Thanks, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for being part of VSA's first web chat of 2018. My name is Claire, and I am part of VSA's Professional Development Working Group. Our group seeks to expand PD opportunities related to visitor studies to both members and non-members of VSA. And one of these efforts is our web chats, which we are doing today. These web chats are intended to be informal opportunities for people to gather together and talk about common interests in our field. Unlike a formal webinar, the idea here is for everybody to contribute in an open discussion so that we can all learn from each other and follow the conversation thread wherever it takes us. So please feel free to make comments or ask questions either using your mic or the chat box whenever seems like an opportune moment. We may incorporate some pauses for comments, but we also want everyone to feel welcome to chime in whenever you see fit. If you haven't found the chat box yet, as I said, it is the little blue icon to the upper left of your screen. And also, if everyone would like to type in introductions there, tell us your name and where you're from. You can share your email address if you want to receive the recording link after we are all done. Now I'd like to introduce our host for today's web chat, Lisa Trahan, who is co-chair of VSA's Bridging Communities FIG, that's Focused Interest Group. I'll turn it over to you, Lisa, to tell us more about today's topic.
Great, thanks, Claire. My name is Lisa Trahan, and I have been at the Lawrence Hall of Science in Berkeley, but I'm moving to San Diego very soon. And as Claire mentioned, I'm the co-chair of the Bridging Communities FIG, which focuses on cultural competence and diversity inclusion in visitor studies. We're working with Claire and the NVSA's Professional Development Work Group to host this web chat to talk about instruments for culturally responsive evaluation, and we're so glad that so many of you are interested in that topic. And the discussants we invited for this chat are people who, just a few people who have presented on a related topic at recent VSA conferences. And our presenters include Aaron Price and Ali Mroczkowski from Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and Stephanie Downey from Randy Korn and Associates. And I saw a note in the chat box, actually, that Stephanie was having trouble joining, so I want to make sure that she actually makes it into the chat room before we get started. Erin Wilcox, do you know if she was able to join? Okay.
Lisa, would you like, well, I can't drop off because I am recording.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I didn't expect this to happen. We have so many people, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, I can try and drop off and then come back on. Just a few more things in case for some reason I can't come back in. I'm going to put my email address in the chat box. If anyone's interested in staying connected with the Bridging Communities group, feel free to email me. My email address is lrt.trahan@gmail.com. Okay, Aaron, go ahead and try and see if that works. Thank you.
Just so everyone knows, there's a possibility that next month we'll be using Zoom as our platform. VSA now has that service, so hopefully we'll be able to include anybody who wants to come.
Great, and I see that Stephanie is able to join, so welcome, Stephanie. Kind of the format for this chat is we're going to have our invited discussants say a little bit about what they hope to share on this topic. As kind of a launch pad for discussion, and it'll just be an opportunity to see what kinds of themes come up from the experiences they've had, and we'll see where it goes from there. And we have a few questions to prompt discussion, but please, as Claire mentioned, jump in with your own questions or examples to share. Feel free to use the chat box because there are so many of us, and we can moderate that. So without further ado, unless there's anything I forgot, we'll go ahead and get started. Aaron and Allie, do you want to say a little bit about what you wanted to share today?
I want to say real fast that we can't find the chat box we're using Internet Explorer, so if anyone types into the chat, we can't see it. If anyone knows of a hotkey you can press to make it pop up or something, let us know and we'll press it, but we can't see anything or show any kind of time. So the project we're working on is a study of adolescent youth who have just graduated from our after-school program and who are now in college. The study is mixed method, so it involves surveys and also interviews. The population we're working with is the majority. So we had to be concerned about cultural issues at the very beginning. And it was designed to try to use culturally responsive and culturally validated instruments throughout the project. Now, just starting its third year of a 5-year project. What I wanted to talk about was to show the 3 things we did on our survey, which has worked very well for us. We try to make them more culturally sensitive. And then Allie's going to talk a little bit about some of the qualitative experience we had doing the in-this interviews and other qualitative methods in this project and others that she has. Would you like me to start with the 3 things that I have now, or did you just want to do it? Hello?
Hi, Aaron. A couple of people have mentioned that they can't hear you very well. If you could move closer to the mic, that might be helpful. And someone suggests that maybe if you roll your mouse over, maybe try on the right side of your screen, that might activate the chat box for you so you can see it.
Thank you. I can also just talk louder if that's better.
Perfect.
I'm trying to roll a mouse, not seeing anything yet, but I also have a weird computer with multiple screens, so I'll play with that after we're done talking. Would you like for me to jump into the 3 recommendations now, or were we just doing an introduction?
Go ahead and share them.
Okay, so if anyone has access to the Google Drive that they set up for this presentation, we uploaded 2 files. One is the PowerPoint from our VSA session that has all this in it, along with some other information. And the other one is a Word file that has a template of a couple of things I'm going to talk about, so that you can just copy and paste them into your own surveys if you decide that you want to use them. The first thing I want to talk about was selecting ethnic and racial information. One of the first things that we started to do, especially after the last election, is simply ask ourselves, do you need to ask for that information? We used to ask that information as a matter of policy, but now it's sensitive. People are worried, and so we now pull that information from any project that does not typically need it in order to answer our evaluation or question. With that said, there are still some projects that information is needed. So what we've done is we've adopted the U.S. Census 2020 Census form, and you can see that form in those 2 documents that I posted. That form has been proposed for the 2020 census. It hasn't been officially approved yet, as far as I know, although I haven't checked the last 6 months for it. So the form basically allows people to write in how they identify and write in as many identities as they want, but also including a checkbox version, and so that it can be pretty easy for people who kind of need scaffolding through it. We've been using this form for about 2 years now, and it's worked very well. People respond very strongly to it. We used to do complaints all the time about how come you have this category, you don't have this category, which I'm sure everyone else has as well. And since we've adopted this format, those issues and questions have gone away almost easily. The only downside is that it's a lengthy form that takes an entire page to fill out. So we did collapse it a little bit. And in the document on the drive, you'll see a long version and you'll see the short version that we created, which takes about half a page to 3/4 of a page. The big problem that we had was when people would turn to this page at the end of the survey, they saw an entire page with all these check boxes and all these open-ended questions, and they freaked, and they're like, wow, this is so much, I thought I was done. And they didn't actually want to fill it out. So having the shorter form solves that issue quite a bit. Pretty much everyone is filling it out, and the data we're getting from it is pretty good. So I would highly recommend using that form. And then, of course, since it's a census form, it means that you're going to be able to compare your results with lots and lots of other people and lots of other studies. The other thing that we did is for gender, we adopted the recommendations of the Human Rights Campaign, which basically has 3 to 4 questions on it. And the questions are worded, let me find it here. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up my specific version so I can give you the exact question of it. But basically we're asking male, female, non-binary, and other on there as well. Oh, and since we've adopted that version, it's worked very well for us as well. We used it to an open-ended question, and which is what the HRC recommended in the past. But you just got lots and lots of answers. It took a lot of time to code that much data if you had thousands of responses. So this new format works very well for us. We've had it for about 2 years, I think, also, or maybe a year and a half. Female, male, non-binary, third gender, prefer to self-describe, and prefer not to say as well. And then the last thing I want to talk about is open-ended questions. So obviously, cultural validation is a thing that we should all be doing, but it's hard. It takes a lot of time, a lot of expertise. There's a lot of debate about how it should be done. When you're in a hurry and you don't have time to do all that, one thing that we've done is when we found something in a survey that we're giving out that we think is going to have different responses from different cultures, basically ask them to define that word in their own words. So an example is we're a science museum, and we're always asking science advocacy questions. So now what we ask is at the very top of the survey, the first question is, what does the word science mean to you? And it's an open-ended question. And then they get the same survey. Everyone gets the same survey. We're analyzing the data, and we've gotten now probably 3,000 or 4,000 responses to that question. We found that they can be cut into about 6 or 7 categories of different types of answers of what science means. And there are cultural differences, different cultural, ethnic, and racial groups, and age groups as well. So I will usually will define science into 1 or 2 of those different categories, which helps us analyze the results of the rest of the survey within the lens of the person who filled it out, knowing that not everyone who fills out the survey is actually answering the same question. When we ask them, for example, how important is science to your daily decision making? Very different people will respond to that. Someone who's thinking of science in terms of a process-oriented thing may say it's not very important to life at all because I don't do a lot of process, where other people might think of science as doing something that's about the grand scheme of life and about ethical decision-making and altruism, may say, yes, science is very important to me, even though they have the exact same experience on a day-to-day basis. They're just answering the question differently. So give people a chance to kind of calibrate and answer the questions in their own words. Those are the 3 main recommendations I have for anyone doing surveying. Allie, do you want to say anything about qualitative?
Allie, maybe can I just say really quickly before you jump in, this is Claire here. I shared the link to the resource folder with all the documents that Erin is referring to. So check the chat box and you can follow the link. You should be able to access that. And also, we are still having a little bit of trouble hearing. It's a little bit better, but any amount you can slow down and get closer to the mic would really help everybody.
See if it can make us a little bit louder. All right, can everybody hear me right now? Or Claire, can you?
Yeah, I can hear you great. Yes. Thank you, Allie.
Okay, great. So as Erin mentioned, I'm going to discuss kind of the role of culturally relevant instruments in qualitative research. So to give you all a bit of background, I'm a mixed methods researcher, and all of my research thus far has focused on racial and cultural experiences in learning settings. In the past, I focused more on formal education settings, such as in the classroom, and now I'm focused more on out-of-school contexts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that happened before I came to the museum, and a lesson I learned from that project that now I've applied to my research here at the museum to make it more culturally relevant. In the previous project, I was responsible for creating an interview protocol that inquired about the role of race and ethnic identity in STEM fields for Latino youth. And I was responsible for creating this interview protocol. And when I created it, before I created it, I had done lots of research on the academic literature on the topic. And what I found overwhelmingly was this idea or this message that people of color, scientists of color, are underrepresented in STEM fields. So given all of that research that, conveyed that message, I made an assumption that the youth who I was going to be interviewing in this STEM program I assumed that they would have had maybe experiences related to their ethnic or racial identity, negative experiences in STEM, such as experiencing microaggressions, such as like an environmental invalidation. And based on those assumptions, I developed my interview protocol as such. And in the interview protocol, I started out by asking questions about, describe, or have you ever had any experiences, negative experiences in science that was related to your identity as a Latino student? And the interviews, they were supposed to be one-on-one, in-depth interviews. We expected that they would be about an hour long. And after I did the first few interviews, I was surprised, but also pleasantly surprised that many of the participants said, no, I've never had any negative experiences in STEM. My racial or cultural identity has really nothing to do with my STEM experience. So these results were contrary to what I had found in the literature and based on what I expected. And as a result, the protocol that I had developed and that I was expecting to have, hour-long conversations with these participants about the role or the impact of their racial or ethnic identity in science and their science experiences, it wasn't applicable to a lot of these students. And I think it was for several reasons. One being the students came from a racially and ethnically homogenous high school. So almost 95% of the student body identified as Latino. And it's possible that students hadn't experienced discriminatory experiences due to their racial or ethnic identity because of the homogeneity of the teacher population, but also the student population at their school. It's also possible that developmentally they were early enough in their career where they hadn't had kind of like a wide breadth of experiences in STEM fields where discrimination could have taken place, the type that was being described in the literature. So again, I made this assumption of cultural homogeneity, meaning that, I expected that, students would have all had similar experiences, and that just was not the case. So what we did then after the first few interviews was we revised the protocol to account for this, this potential outcome. And what we did is we asked participants about important people in their life who also identified as Latino. And we said, for example, has anybody in your family or any of your close friends experienced discrimination as a result of their identity? And what happened was students started to open up. I think because, number one, they didn't have to talk about themselves. They felt more comfortable talking about other people. But then just naturally, they talked about their friends and their family members' experiences, and then they started to reflect and think about their own experiences as well. And we also included questions in which we presented, these friends to them and said, there's a trend that youth of color are underrepresented in STEM fields relative to their population in the United States. So, why do you think this might be? How do you think this might impact your experience going forward in the future? And we got much, much richer discussions, much more, fulfilling conversations with the participants because we were talking about a topic that now was relevant to their lives through the vicarious experiences of other important people in their lives, and it ended up being much more worthwhile experience. So the main takeaway from this experience for me, and now an exercise that I engage in whenever I'm developing an interview protocol in future projects, is to think about, as I'm developing the protocol, what are my own assumptions about what do I expect from these interviews? What do I expect that the population that who I'm going to be talking to has experienced? And then I ask myself, am I making an assumption of homogeneity? And how can I revise my interview protocol to account for the possibility that my assumption is wrong, which most of the time my assumptions are disconfirmed. So, and then finally, I kind of create this hypothetical scenario in which I get null responses to my interview protocol. So if I ask some questions and participants just say, no, that's not relevant to me, I try to brainstorm questions that I can ask them, follow-up questions that then may tap into an experience that was relevant to them so that I can make the most of the interview. So yeah, if anybody has any questions on that, I'm happy to expand further.
Great, thank you, Allie. Stephanie, do you want to go ahead and share a little bit about your experience?
Sure. So I'm Stephanie Downey. I'm director at RK&A. And unlike Aaron and Allie, who are doing research internally in an organization and setting their own research agenda to a certain extent, RK&A we're consultants, and so we're hired by clients. And so we're not setting the research agenda ourselves, but we're responding to whatever it is our client wants to study or needs to know. And then we develop the best research approach and instruments to answer their questions. So much of the time we're working with museums that serve a culturally homogeneous audience, and over the years this has been the case. As we all know, audiences at museums are typically very homogeneous. So in the past, we didn't run into this problem as much as it's starting to crop up now, as more museums are reaching out to diverse audiences and having questions about that. More and more of our research needs to be culturally responsive. So I'm going to talk about a particular example that really illustrates the challenges of doing research in a situation where the audience you're collecting data from is very different, not only from me as the researcher, but from the client serving the audience. So we were hired by Cool Culture, which is an organization in New York City. Let me tell you a little bit about them. They're a nonprofit organization that is based in New York and connects low-income families with cultural institutions for free. So that they provide a pass to families that qualify that allow them to go to 90 different museums and cultural organizations across the 5 boroughs of New York. But they also provide a lot of other programming in the various boroughs. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to look across all of their programming across the 5 boroughs, so looking across all the families they serve, regardless of program that they participate in, and understand what kind of effect they're having on their audiences and measure the outcomes. So not only are the audiences very different from me as the researcher and from the client, they're also different from one another. So many of them are immigrants, but in the Bronx, for example, many of the families are from the Caribbean. In Chinatown in Manhattan, they're Chinese immigrants. In Spanish Harlem in Manhattan, they're Latino families. So we were up against a real challenge with this one, and I knew that it would be really important to get the language right. So Cool Culture wanted to be efficient in this process, and they wanted to use a survey. And to save resources, they wanted their staff to administer the survey across the 5 boroughs at these various programs. So the survey had to be efficient and short and to the point, and they wanted it to be something they could continue to use after they worked with me. At the time, and now in retrospect, I think qualitative research would have been a better approach and given them more answers to their questions, but we were really trying to be efficient. So the first step was for me to meet with the Cool Culture staff and help them prioritize the outcomes they wanted to measure in the study. And this is a typical part of our process, is that we meet with the client to deconstruct the outcomes and operationalize them so that we can understand them in concrete terms and measure them through a survey. And in this case, we went beyond just talking to staff, and we met with representatives from the various audiences they served to hear what they thought of these outcomes that Cool Culture was striving for and how they thought about them and made sense of them. So the goal of talking to Cool Culture and to the audiences was to make sure that we were using concepts and language in the survey that would resonate with the people completing the survey. So going into this process, I expected that the language that the Cool Culture staff would be different from the audiences that they serve. That's very much an expectation I had. But what I didn't anticipate is that at the very core, the audiences had different, or they conceived of the outcomes differently than the Cool Culture staff. So it wasn't just about language differences, but like in Erin's example with science, that people think of science differently, that came out as well. So I'm going to give you one example. One of the outcomes Cool Culture wants to happen as a result of their programming is for parents to see themselves as key to their child's education. And to Cool Culture and to the museum educators who were working on this project with us, what that meant was that they wanted parents to see themselves as key to their child's education throughout every aspect of life. So not just about school, but thinking of learning as something that happens throughout the day in lots of different ways, in museums, but also outside of museums. But for the parents from Chinatown, the way they conceived of this outcome is that their role is important as parents, but it's not about informal education. It's about academic achievement and making sure that they apply the concepts that their children learn in school when they visit a museum. So those very different perspectives became challenging in designing the survey. And I'll stop there. I just want to say that in the end, I think that the Cool Culture staff learned a lot about their audience, but I don't think we did what we set out to do, which was to measure their outcomes, because what they found out is that their audiences have different ideas about their outcomes. So they learned a lot, they just didn't learn what they expected to learn. And I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. I want to encourage people, if you have questions based on what the discussants have shared so far, feel free to ask questions in the chat box. And I noticed that there were some interesting themes coming up in the different things that you talked about. One of the big ones I noticed is kind of like related to assumptions and kind of getting to the root of what, how different people and different groups of people are understanding the same questions. And so I'm wondering if you could, oh great, there's questions coming in. Great. So one question came in. So thinking about the kind of how different people are interpreting questions, does using validated language, and this is kind of just open for discussion, does using validated language facilitate shared understanding in your experience?
This is Stephanie. In our case, we were designing the survey from scratch based on what the client wanted to measure, so we were unable to use any kind of validated language or pre-existing instruments.
This is Erin. We get all of our instrumentation possible from the research literature, so Google Scholar is our friend. And we try to find them, and then we email the authors if they don't actually have the instruments in their paper. I'd be interested in other people's ideas if anybody has any recommendations. recommendations.
Thanks for mentioning Google Scholar as a place that you go to find resources to use for instruments. Another question came in about other places you could look for information about culturally responsive tools or info. I would check out the website for the Center for CREA, Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Assessment. And they have, I believe, a bibliography page and a publications page that has a lot of different resources in one place, mostly kind of academic journal articles about the topics, but definitely a great place to start.
And I have another resource I can mention from the Public Policy Associates. There's a document called The Tenets of a Culturally Responsive and Racial Equity Lens Evaluation Process. But it lists like 6 or 7 different things to keep in mind as you're developing an evaluation to be culturally responsive. And so I'll just list a couple of them. One is to take the time to understand the specific culture being evaluated. So I think Erin, Allie, and I all gave examples of ways that we attempted to do that. Another is to examine your own backgrounds and beliefs, so not forgetting that you have assumptions, keeping those in mind. Another is to engage community and stakeholders in discussion around a program's purpose and outcomes. So again, that's something we did in our process. And there are other tenets, but I won't read them all.
Great. Another question came in. So I'm just going to read the question. I'm still processing the question. So I'd be interested in seeing a bad question, understanding why it's bad, and then seeing the revised good version of a question and why it was good. Yeah, I think that's, I'm not sure whether we can go through that process now, but I think that's a great suggestion for something that could be organized in the future, is looking at examples of the ways that surveys or interview protocols or other procedures have been improved to be more responsive. I think that's a great suggestion.
I can give an example if you want.
Yeah, that would be great.
The project that I spoke about for Cool Culture. And it's not an example of a good question versus a bad question, but an example of how we analyze the response to the question. So remember, this is a standardized survey, and the question is, what do you see as your main role when you visit a museum with your children? And then they're asked to select one option, and there are 4 options. For Cool Culture, the best answer is to explore and learn together. That's what they hope parents take away. But what we found from this process is that that's not the best outcome for some parents, depending on their own belief systems. And so for some parents, the best option is to guide my child to focus his or her learning. So the question didn't change, but the way we think about the answers has to change. And there really is no best answer. And that's what I meant when I said that Cool Culture learned a lot about their audience, but we didn't really measure whether they had achieved their outcomes.
Great, thanks.
I think this is a good general question too for anyone who's on the call, is if any of you have an example of a bad survey item that you revised, or a bad one that you don't know how to revise, we'd be interested to hear.
I don't think it's so much about wording the vocabulary of questions, what questions you're asking and how you analyze them. So it's a good question, but hard to answer, like most good questions are.
Can you say a little bit more about what you're proposing instead?
Well, I am not for I guess what I'm saying is the question of is an item good or bad by itself is not really something that can be determined based upon the wording, the vocabulary that's used in the item. There might be some research on item format and cultural differences. I'm not aware of any, but I would love to hear if anyone knows of some research about differences between how people respond to formatting. But vocabulary, it's really about, is it appropriate to ask this question to the group and how you analyze it? Again, with the science question, I mentioned, and asking people how important is science in your daily life is a very valid item, a very valid constructed item for most people, but how we analyze it, by analyzing it all in one group, that's where we're being culturally not sensitive, by putting everything into one group and not dividing it out, now that we know that different groups have different definitions of what that question means.
Thanks. Yeah.
I think it also goes back to the importance of knowing the population and knowing your group. And again, not so much about the wording of it, but is what's being conveyed by asking your question. Something I can think about too that has to go along with this assumption of cultural homogeneity is in the news and mainstream media, we hear a lot about the role of immigration in the lives of Latinos in the United States. Something in my research that I've come across and I found is that for many youth, especially later generation youth, immigration is a non-issue for many of them. So in constructing surveys or research questions with Latino youth, I would have to keep in mind the diversity in terms of generational status and realize that if I'm interested in issues of immigration, it may not be pertinent to all Latino youth. So therefore, I might construct a perfectly worded question, but is it relevant to my population? Is it relevant to the group? And what kind of assumptions am I making by asking them this question?
Something I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about is, so what I'm hearing is that once you have a question that you think might be get you interesting information, you kind of need to try it out. And so I'm curious to know what that process looks like and kind of when do you feel ready to try out questions and see what kind of responses you're getting and start to analyze to see if there are those kinds of differences and kind of what does that process look like?
For us, we don't do it nearly enough, I'll be honest about that. When we have done it, it's in the form of content review. One of the advantages of working at a large museum is that it's very easy to go on the museum floor and find the demographic that we're targeting and offer them an incentive, a gift card to the store or something like that, or a coffee, to sit down and have us read the questions to them and ask them to explain what they think it means, how they would answer it, how they would word those questions if they were asking their friends and their family, things like that. We've done that some, but we don't do it enough. That's something we need to do better at.
And we do that with all of our instruments, regardless of the audience. So we pilot test all of our instruments. Sometimes that's similar to what Aaron just described, where you ask somebody to look at the instrument and talk or think critically about it and give us feedback. Sometimes that means we just go out and test it and try it out and see how well the questions work.
Thanks. And so we got a follow-up question. I think this is for Allie. Allie, could you say a little bit more about, you mentioned generational status, that it's not an issue or is a non-issue. Can you just explain a little bit more about that?
So I did use the term non-issue, but I would like to revise that and say it's less of a relevant issue for youth whose families have been in the United States for several generations. Because they and their immediate family members in their microsystem may not be as affected directly by issues of immigration. However, things like the negative stereotypes or a negative cultural kind of like attitude toward immigrants and then the assumptions that people make about later generations based on their racial or ethnic identity they could definitely be affected in that way. But in terms of the immediate threat of deportation, that may not be an issue. So filling out things such as like DACA, for example, or policy related to the DREAM Act may not be as directly relevant to them as other more pressing issues, such as how to pay for college, for example. So I guess that's what I meant in terms of how generational status it contributes to the diversity and the heterogeneity of Latino youth. And for some youth, it may, based on their generational status, for example, if they themselves or their family are undocumented, policy issues regarding immigration may be of much more immediate importance to them than whose families have been established in the United States for several generations.
Great, thank you for clarifying. Other questions that are on people's minds?
I just want to pop on quick to say it looks like maybe some people have issues viewing the chat, and if that's the case, I'll just copy all the resources from the chat after this, and I compile them and send them out via email. But if you want to receive that, I'll have to have your email, so send me an email, claire@rockman.com, to get those resources. It's a little great logistics.
So another theme that I heard come up when you were sharing initially about your work is kind of the question of choosing the right methods for the project you're working on and for the groups you're working with. And so I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on that and kind of the question of when your client wants to do a survey, how do you kind of talk and kind of broaden their perspective on possible options for methods?
This is Stephanie. I'll say that I have a bias toward qualitative research because that's my background. But I was very keen on working with Cool Culture on developing a survey because I felt like it was a huge challenge. And I was hopeful that I could do it well. But after the process, I really realized how challenging it is. And I don't have any particular answers, but I'm still very interested in knowing how you can design a standardized instrument for a culturally diverse audience that works well. I don't have answers.
We don't work with consultants that much, so our clients are mostly internal, which gives us, I think, a little bit more leeway to push back. But basically, whenever we have our first meeting on a new project and anyone brings up any kind of methodology, I cut the conversation fast. And I tell them, we're not talking about methods right now. We need to talk about what you want to answer, what are your research questions, what are your burning questions, all questions like that. And then we go to them later with methods based upon that first conversation. Based upon that conversation, we think to do X, Y, and Z. So we try not to, because so many people come to us and say, well, I want to do a survey on what people think about this exhibit. And that's all that they've thought about. And so by cutting it right there, it saves a lot of time later, not even have that conversation. I don't know if clients that are paying you would appreciate that, but when you're dealing with internal people, you can get away with it.
Yeah, we take a similar approach most of the time. This is an unusual situation where they had this challenge of having an audience spread all around the 5 boroughs of New York and wanted to be efficient and didn't have a very big budget. So, and like I said, I saw it as a challenge I wanted to take on. But in retrospect, it probably should have been qualitative research.
So we had a question come in more generally about kind of doing evaluation during a pilot phase of a project. So just curious to hear discussants' thoughts. When, with a new project in a pilot phase, when would you start doing evaluation? And what might that look like?
It varies a lot, but obviously the earlier the better. So right now we're working with a museum that's developing a new school program, and they hired us from the very beginning. So we're a part of the process of developing the program with them, but we serve a very specific purpose of being the lens of the student. And we did early research as they started to implement this program and pilot it. We did observations, and now we've moved on to the summative phase. But that doesn't always happen. It's sort of a luxury.
Great, thanks. Another theme that I heard come out in the discussion is about outcomes. Erin was just mentioning that related to kind of having the outcomes and goals conversation before getting ahead of ourselves with the methods conversation. And Stephanie had also mentioned kind of differing priorities or understandings of outcomes between the audience and the staff, the client. And so I was curious to hear kind of some more reflections on what are some of the challenges that you face when you're developing instruments that are culturally responsive related to outcomes and clarifying what the outcomes are.
Sorry, please.
No, you go ahead, Aaron.
I hate to keep harping on this, but when the outcome on the surface level sounds clear, but then you realize there are cultural differences in what the outcome means to people, and then it can be hard, and you can be drawing a logic model or a connection with tons of different lines, between what you're trying to measure, what is really there, and what people are interested in and on it. So I would say that's probably the most challenging thing that would happen to us. And that might be our problem in not making the original outcomes precise enough when we were defining them. And I think a solution to that is just to always be thinking about the cultural aspects and the cultural differences. This is something when I was in graduate school, I was not trained on. I'm surprised, but the education department I came from did not talk about this a whole lot. And then when I hit the real world, I'm like, oh my gosh, everything is about culture. And so it's been, a good 5 to 10 years of training to be thinking about it all the time.
I have an example from my own work recently. It wasn't with a particularly diverse population, but we didn't want to assume what the outcomes of interest were for people going into this exhibit. And so we asked them on the what is your motivation? Gave them a nice long list. And we're still in the process of analyzing that data because then we then again asked them on the post, to what extent were those motivations met by the experience. I don't know that this is a particularly good way to handle it, but it's something we're trying. And we also left a fill in the blank. So, you could select multiple motivations and you could also write in your own. And so that was sort of like defining your own outcomes. But I do think it's going to be tricky for analysis, and I don't know that it's the most elegant way to handle that kind of issue.
And honestly, we're talking about culturally responsive evaluation, but program development and exhibit development needs to be culturally responsive as well. And I don't know how much that happens or how much it's taken into consideration. But if you bring an evaluator in at the end of a program and culture hasn't been thought about until then, it's almost too late.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. So I'm curious because Aaron and Allie are internal. Kind of how, what kind of discussions have you experienced working internally and kind of introducing and talking about the topic of culture kind of maybe throughout that process if you're working with exhibits or program staff?
In general, the department here at the museum does a lot more summative and formative work. And so we see a lot of the examples that she just gave, and I couldn't agree more with Stephanie on that, where it was not thought about, and then we bring it up when we're ready to start doing some kind of an analysis, because we'll be like, what are your learning goals of this program or this exhibit? It's blah. All right, well, our audience here on the south side of Chicago is extremely diverse, and so we start bringing this up, and we say, what do you think so-and-so is going to get out of this? What do you think so-and-so's in? They're really quite surprised in most cases to be thinking about that. But the nice part of that is that the culture institutionally is changing as people think about it more and more. And so people are starting to bring it up at the early phases of development. Much more in our education programming than in our exhibits, but it's starting to show up there as well. So things are changing, but right now, not a whole lot of stuff. A lot of those discussions happen on the front end.
Yeah, I'd be interested if there are any other folks in the web chat. I'm sure there's lots of different experiences in terms of that and kind of what your process is like if you're working internally or with clients. So we have about 4 minutes left. Are there other questions that people would like to ask? Feel free to put them in the chat box. Or if anyone has any final thoughts they'd like to share.
I'll just jump on what Aaron just said about things are changing. I've been in this field for almost 20 years, and this was never talked about 10, 15 years ago. So just the fact that it's becoming a topic of interest says a lot, and it will take time. But it's enlightening to hear from all of you, and it's nice to see all the interest in this topic, and we just have to give it time.
So one question did come in, which I think is we only have a couple minutes to discuss, but I think it's a great kind of next steps question, and kind of thinking about, like you were saying, Stephanie, how this is becoming more and more part of people's work. What things are your teams doing in terms of training for data collectors to be more culturally responsive?
Here at MSI in the last year, we've done a lot of the department-wide cultural humility training, which has helped, and that's helped mainly because it's created discussions that our department now has during our team meetings and stuff, and our lunches, frankly. So just keeping that discussion going so that it's always an issue, it's always something being talked about and thought about thoughtfully, as opposed to episodically. In terms of technically, we don't do a recommendation I would have is to have an experienced you're working with, to have them do the cognitive interviews with the instrument that they're handing out with members of that population that they're going to be handing them out to.
And Aaron, for those who aren't familiar, can you tell us what a cognitive interview is?
I'm not an expert in it, so someone else can jump in. But the way we use it here is we have staff sit down with guests and basically do the survey in an interview format. We ask them the questions on the survey, and then we ask them to answer the questions. And then we ask them what they think the questions were asking, what were the questions about. We ask them, how would you reword this question? How would you say this question to a friend or a family member? Or we ask questions like that to try to get an idea of what they were answering when they're answering the question, if it's aligned with our construct behind the instrument. It's like basically a 15-minute sit down, do the survey face to face. Do you want to add anything to that?
I see, Jeremy, you brought up personal meaning mapping. Can you tell us about that in about 30 seconds or less? Jeremy says no. Jeremy says no, but that's a good one to Google if you haven't heard of it before. Probably a good topic for our next web chat, maybe.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Well, that brings us to the 1 o'clock Eastern hour, and so I think we better wrap it up, but I am so glad that all of you decided to join us today. Our large size maybe made it a little bit difficult for everyone to participate as actively, which is too bad, but also I'm really glad people used the chat, and I will be sure to try to find a way to compile all these resources to share them out with you. If you haven't put your email in the chat box or sent it to me directly, I won't have a way to send you the resources. So just a heads up. You'll need to find some way to get in touch with me if you want to receive both the recording and the list of all these resources that people have put here today. Lisa, is there anything else we should say in closing?
I just want to thank everyone for joining, and especially thank Aaron, Allie, and Stephanie for being our discussants. And thank you, Claire, for organizing.
Thank you, guys. This has been a great discussion, and I look forward to many more. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.